The morning had that peculiar stillness that only the brownstone can achieve when the city outside is busy enough to ignore you, but quiet enough to make every footstep on our hallways sound like a drumbeat. I was balancing a plate of eggs on one hand and my notebook on the other when Fritz announced that we had a visitor. He did it in that precise tone that suggests, without saying it aloud, that this was someone Wolfe would prefer not to see. True to form, Wolfe did not rise from his chair behind the great desk in the centre of the office. He did, however, look up from the morning paper with a disdainful arch of one eyebrow. "A visitor?" he asked, in that tone which can slice through steel. "Yes, sir. She's in the front parlour, a Mrs. Tallman. She says it's urgent." Wolfe didn't move. He merely let out a low, barely audible hum that could be interpreted as a sigh or a growl. "Urgent, you say?" He adjusted the newspaper so that only his eyes peeked above the top. "Bring her in." Mrs. Tallman was a woman in her early 50s, neat to the point of severity, wearing a hat that looked like it had survived several seasons of city dust and social obligations. She carried a leather-bound notebook tucked under one arm. She moved with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime ensuring that every encounter adhered to her expectations. I had an immediate dislike for her, but Wolfe, I could tell, was calculating something entirely different. "Mr. Wolfe," she began without preamble, "I need your assistance. My family's recipes, our legacy, have been compromised." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Compromised?" "Yes." She placed the notebook on the desk with a careful reverence. "This cookbook is more than a collection of recipes. It's been in my family for generations. Recently, certain changes have been made without my approval. Ingredients swapped, instructions altered. Someone is tampering with it, and I fear it goes beyond mere mistakes. Someone may be trying to ruin us socially, financially, perhaps worse." Wolfe leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands folded neatly over his stomach. "You are aware," he said, deliberately slow, "that I do not involve myself in culinary disputes, nor am I a judge of family honor in matters of cuisine." "I understand, Mr. Wolfe," she said quickly, as though anticipating the refusal. "But this is not just about taste or reputation. My family has invested decades into this cookbook, which is about to be published. Errors could destroy our contract with the publisher and potentially defame our name. I'm asking you to find the person responsible. I'll pay whatever fee you require." I could feel the corners of my mouth twitch. Of course, Wolfe never charges anything less than exorbitant if there's a whiff of scandal or intrigue involved, and the phrasing errors could destroy our contracts more than domestic carelessness. It smelled like deliberate sabotage. Wolfe didn't move a muscle for a long moment, then finally spoke. A threat to your family's reputation, you say? And you insist that these alterations are intentional?" "Yes, absolutely. I can't be certain of the method or the motive, but something has changed. The custard recipe, the seasoning for the duck, it's subtle, but wrong. And it's not a matter of taste. It is malicious." I scribbled a few notes in my pad, mostly about the woman herself. Her eyes flicked nervously toward Wolfe, who remained still as a statue, perfectly comfortable in his own scrutiny. "I see," Wolfe murmured. He tapped a finger lightly against his desk. "Tell me, Mrs. Tallman, is there anyone with access to this cookbook outside your family?" "Yes. The publisher's assistant, a few freelance editors, and a household staff member. That's all. But I assure you no one else could possibly know the intricacies of these recipes." Wolfe folded the newspaper and placed it carefully to the side. "I will consider your request," he said. "However, I do not promise action. My time is not lightly devoted to matters that do not affect me personally." Mrs. Tallman's gaze sharpened. "I understand. But you must know, Mr. Wolfe, that this is no ordinary misprint. This is a targeted act. If you agree to take the case, I can provide the original manuscripts and a list of everyone who has had access. There are letters, emails, even handwritten notes. You will have everything you need to find the culprit." Wolfe didn't respond immediately. He tilted his head slightly, the gears in his mind turning audibly, or at least audibly, to me. Finally, he said, "Very well. I will take your case, Mrs. Tolman, but I warn you, I do not chase trivialities. If this is mere human error, you will have wasted your time and mine." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. You won't regret this. The integrity of my family depends on it." I knew better than to interfere. Wolfe had taken the case. That was all that mattered at this point. I could already see the layers of subtle deception beginning to form, like a spice slowly simmering in the back of the kitchen. Who would tamper with a cookbook? What personal motive could drive such a meticulous act? And how far would they go to see the Tolman name revered in culinary circles, trishul discredited? As Mrs. Tolman left, Fritz appeared, carrying a tray of breakfast I had mostly ignored. "Archie," Wolfe said, still seated like a monolith of contemplation, "we begin. Make the necessary inquiries. Discover who touched that cookbook and why." I tossed my fork onto the plate. "I was hoping for a quiet morning, Wolfe, not espionage over custard recipes." He didn't reply. He rarely did. But the expression on his face, one of barely concealed intrigue, told me everything I needed to know. The brownstone had been disturbed, however lightly, and that was enough to make Wolfe interested. That, and the hint of intellectual challenge, he could not resist. I already felt the first threads of the case winding themselves around me, sticky and flavorful, like the caramel in a perfectly baked flan. And I knew, as always, that while I chased leads, interviewed suspects, and followed the scent through the city streets, Wolfe would remain in the shadows of the office, orchestrating every move with nothing but his mind and his words. I took a deep breath, checked the list of names Mrs. Tolman had left, and prepared to step into a world of culinary intrigue where every ingredient, every line of instruction could be a clue or a trap. I spent the better part of the morning making calls and following the subtle breadcrumbs Mrs. Tolman had left behind. The first thing that struck me was how carefully she'd maintained the list of people with access to the cookbook. Not a single name seemed out of place, yet something in the way the names were grouped: household staff, separate from publishing contacts, freelance editors at arm's length, suggested that someone within the inner circle could be playing both sides. My first stop was the publishing office on West 45th Street. The assistant she mentioned, a young woman named Clara Henshaw, was efficient, polite, and precisely the kind of person who smiled while keeping her thoughts tucked firmly behind a veil of professional courtesy. I asked her about the cookbook and any recent anomalies. "Oh, yes," she said, glancing around as though the walls themselves might be listening. There were a few edits that struck me as odd. Not big mistakes exactly, but changes in phrasing, ingredient amounts that were slightly off. I assumed it was the author's stylistic choice. Or someone else's, I suggested, leaning on the edge of her desk. She frowned, a flicker of uncertainty passing across her expression. "I wouldn't know. Everything goes through the publisher, and any final changes are approved before printing. I didn't touch the manuscript after last week." Her alibi was neat, but not entirely reassuring. I made a mental note to check the publisher's records, later numbers, timestamps, and digital footprints that often tell a story no polite assistant can hide. From there, I swung by the freelance editor's office, a cramped apartment in Hell's Kitchen that smelled faintly of tobacco and ink. Henry Carow was an aging man with a mind still sharp enough to find joy in a pun, but not sharp enough to conceal anxiety when I asked about his recent work. "The cookbook?" I made a few corrections, of course, he admitted. Spelling, phrasing, nothing more. I wouldn't dare alter a recipe. That's sacrilege. Yet you were the last one to touch it before the manuscript returned to the publisher? I asked. He nodded, hands twisting together. Yes. But I swear, Archie, nothing malicious. I'm a professional. That's all. I left him with a polite nod, though his nervous glance as I exited the building suggested there might be more than he was admitting. Back in the brownstone, the quiet of the office had shifted subtly. Wolfe sat in his chair, the newspaper folded neatly at his side. The faint aroma of coffee and cigar smoke hung in the air, a reminder that while the day outside spun on with its usual urgency, here we were in a controlled, measured space. "Find anything of interest, Archie?" he asked, without looking up. "Maybe," I said. "The assistant's alibi is tidy." The freelance editor seems genuinely nervous, but nothing concrete. "It's early yet. Everyone's behaving like they're supposed to behave." Wolfe's eyes, sharp and unblinking, fixed on me. "Early, yes, but that nervousness you noted may be the crucial clue. You should not discount subtleties, Goodwin. People reveal more when they think they are concealing everything." I nodded, trying to conceal my impatience. Subtlety was Wolfe's domain. Mine was the dirty, direct, legwork confronting people, finding inconsistencies and smelling out deception in real time. The brownstone itself seemed to respond to the tension, its hallways quieter than usual, the usual bustle reduced to muted echoes. Fritz entered with a tray of tea, glancing at Wolfe and then me, a silent acknowledgement that the day had already taken a turn from normalcy to intrigue. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, "Mrs. Tolman left a note. She says she received a curious letter this morning addressed to her at the publishing house, claiming the recipe alterations were intentional and signed with a pseudonym." Wolfe's hand moved almost imperceptibly to the desk. "A letter, you say? Bring it to me." I took the envelope from Fritz. The paper was heavy, the ink unusually precise. There was a single sentence typed in all caps. "The integrity of the family's recipes must be tested or destroyed." No signature, just the odd punctuation and the sterile threat of the words themselves. Wolfe read the note silently, then looked at me. "A direct challenge, Goodwin. Someone wants us to know that they are watching, that they are active, and they are confident enough to communicate with the client without fear of immediate reprisal." "Or they want to provoke us," I said. "See how quickly we react. See if we make a mistake." "Exactly." He leaned back, fingers steepled. "They miscalculate, however, if they believe this office will react with haste rather than deliberation. Now you will need to revisit every person who had access to the manuscript. Observe, inquire, and document. I want a complete map of the interactions, the access points, and any deviations from routine." The day stretched on with a relentless undercurrent of observation. I went to the publishing house again, this time reviewing the logs of manuscript edits, timestamps of access, and delivery records. Subtle patterns began to emerge. The same edits appearing in two separate instances, only, after late-night access, a slight rearrangement in recipe order, almost imperceptible unless compared side by side. Returning to the brownstone, I found Wolfe still in the same position, as though time had folded around him. "Archie," he said without preamble, "do you notice anything unusual about the staff, about the visitors, or the very air in which these manuscripts move?" I smiled faintly. "It's quiet, Mr. Wolfe. Too quiet. Even the city noise seems muffled here, and everyone I've met acts impeccably, almost rehearsing. It's like walking through a stage play where the actors are terrified of missing a line." Wolfe's eyes glinted. "Then we must observe the smallest deviations, a single misplaced gesture, a hesitation, an overly neat apology. These may be the keys. Humans are imperfect, Archie. They cannot completely hide their intentions." By late afternoon, a few threads had begun to tangle. Clara Henshaw had been seen lingering near the office late after hours, ostensibly filing documents, but with no witnesses confirming her purpose. Henry Carrow's nervous smile had shifted to an irritability that seemed almost rehearsed when questioned again about a minor change in the duck recipe. And the household staff, while outwardly dutiful, had a faint sense of withheld knowledge, a collective awareness of events just beyond our reach. Wolfe, as ever, remained unmoved. He sipped his coffee, observed the city through the window, and allowed the tension to rise without a hint of urgency. The brownstone, for all its calm and order, had been quietly disturbed. The reverberations were subtle, intellectual, and infinitely more dangerous than a simple theft. It was clear this was no ordinary case of miswritten recipes or editorial carelessness. Someone was orchestrating, someone was watching, and the game had only just begun. And while I ran through the city streets chasing leads, Wolfe would shape the course of events from this chair, quietly dictating the tempo, the traps, and the exposure that would eventually bring the culprit to the surface. The next day, I returned to the brownstone early, notebook in hand, prepared to sift through the subtle traces of human behavior that Wolfe had so pointedly emphasized. The letter Mrs. Tallman had received was still on the desk, its typed threat hanging in the air like the faint tang of a forgotten spice. Wolfe was already seated, cigar smouldering, eyes narrowed in what I took to be intense contemplation. "You have observed and recorded the movements of everyone on Mrs. Tallman's list?" he asked, his voice calm but cutting. "Yes." "And I've found some inconsistencies worth noting," I said, flipping open my pad. First, Clara Henshaw, the assistant at the publisher, was seen lingering in the office after hours, supposedly filing, though no one corroborates why. Second, Henry Carrow, the freelance editor, showed a nervous irritability when questioned again about a minor recipe alteration in the duck dish. Third, the household staff, particularly the kitchen aide, a man named Rolfe, seemed to withhold information. They're dutiful but oddly evasive. Wolfe exhaled a thin plume of smoke and tapped his fingers together. "These are the threads, Archie. Pull carefully, or they will snap under pressure." "Tell me more about Rolfe. He's a meticulous worker," I explained, "and fiercely loyal to the Tallmans, but small details suggest he's aware of things he shouldn't be. For instance, the cookbook was moved from the main kitchen to the side pantry without Mrs. Tallman's knowledge. Rolfe says it was for safekeeping, but the timestamp doesn't match any typical routine. Also, he was unusually hesitant when I asked if anyone else had touched it." Wolfe remained silent, but the gleam in his eyes indicated he was digesting each nuance. "Human behavior, Goodwin," he said finally, "is predictable only to the extent it can be catalogued. Each deviation is a potential key. Do you have the chronology of interactions?" "Yes," I said, laying out a rough timeline on the desk. The manuscript moved between Mrs. Tallman, Henshaw, Carrow, and the staff in this order. First draft returned from the Tallman estate to the publisher. Henshaw reviewed it during the morning hours. Carrow made adjustments late in the day. Rolfe handled final physical storage overnight. The letter arrived in the morning after Carrow's edits, before Rolfe accessed it for safekeeping. Oddly, the timing seems too perfect. Wolfe tapped the ash from his cigar into the tray, eyes never leaving me. "Perfect," he murmured. "A man may plan an hour in advance, but rarely can he anticipate the consequences of a sequence extending over 3 individuals and 2 locations. Someone is testing boundaries. Someone is intentionally creating tension and uncertainty." I nodded, jotting down the observation. It matched my sense of the game unfolding around us. Whoever was responsible wasn't merely tampering with recipes, they were asserting psychological dominance, a subtle intellectual challenge aimed at both Mrs. Tallman and us. The first person I sought out was Clara Henshaw. She was reluctant to meet me in person again, citing deadlines, but finally relented in a small cafe near the publishing house. Over coffee, I pressed her gently about the late-night office visits. "I just wanted to make sure the edits were ready for delivery," she said quickly, eyes darting across the room. "The manuscript had to be submitted by Friday." I stayed late, only to finalize the wording. "Alone?" I asked. "Yes. Mr. Caro came in later, but he only stayed briefly." She twirled her spoon nervously, and I caught a brief hesitation. "Why? Do you think I tampered with the cookbook?" "I don't think," I said, choosing my words. "I observe, and right now your timeline and behavior require corroboration. You understand, of course, that any deviation could be crucial." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I understand." Next, I confronted Henry Caro at his apartment. He was more agitated than before. "I've already told you," he said, pacing. "I only corrected phrasing. I didn't alter the recipes beyond spelling mistakes. I swear." "Yet the note arrived the next morning," I said. "Someone with access knew the manuscript was vulnerable." "I don't know anything about that," he snapped. His face flushed, and his hands moved in little gestures of frustration. "Yes, I was nervous. I always get nervous with deadlines. But nothing malicious. I couldn't do it. I left him recording every detail, every shift of expression. Nervousness, defensiveness, and over-explanation are as revealing as outright confessions. The trick was to see who could maintain a facade under pressure and who would crack. Finally, I spoke to Rolfe, the kitchen aide. The brownstone was quieter than usual, each step echoing. He answered politely, but gave short, clipped replies. I moved the cookbook to the side pantry as instructed. "Nothing more," he said. When I asked whether anyone else touched it, he hesitated briefly, then shook his head. That split second of delay, the almost imperceptible twitch of his jaw, was all I needed to note for Wolfe. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was reviewing the information I collected. "Each individual is a node in a network," he said. "Observe them together, and the discrepancies reveal themselves. Alone, they are merely unremarkable, but together a pattern emerges." I nodded. Patterns were emerging. Clara, anxious but careful. Caro, irritable yet nervous. Rolfe, cautious and precise. And Mrs. Tolman herself, anxious yet dignified, moving between fear for her family legacy and the need to trust us with its defense. Each had a motive, each had opportunity, and each had the potential to unravel the carefully woven sequence of events. That evening, I compiled a list of further observations for Wolfe, timestamps of manuscript movements, minor inconsistencies in statements, and peculiar behaviors that didn't fit anyone's official schedule. Even the smallest gestures, a hand resting too long on a door handle, a quick glance over the shoulder, the tone of a repeated explanation were marked. Wolfe, as always, absorbed it all in silence. Finally he spoke. "Goodwin, the game has begun. The players have revealed themselves, though they do not yet know the stakes. They believe they control the flow of events. Let them continue. Our advantage is patience, observation, and the inevitability of truth. And remember, there is no action required but thought, and no strength required but intellect." I leaned back in my chair and allowed a wry smile to escape. I liked the sound of that. No punches thrown, no chases, no street brawls, just observation, deduction, and careful manipulation, just how Wolfe liked it, and just how I had learned to operate under his direction. The circle of suspects was defined, each a potential instigator of the tampering, each with secrets yet to be revealed. And somewhere in the quiet of the brownstone, Wolfe's mind was already setting the pieces in motion for what promised to be a precise, surgical unraveling of deception. The tension was there, thick enough to taste, and I knew We were only at the very beginning. The next morning, I hit the streets with Wolfe's list of names and a sense of purpose sharpened by the subtle tensions I had catalogued the day before. The brownstone, calm and immovable, was already a memory in the rear-view mirror. The city outside, with its endless ebb and flow, would provide the context I needed to see the threads more clearly. First, I revisited Clara Henshaw at the publishing office. She was already at her desk, typing with the precise rhythm of someone who had internalized the hum of bureaucracy as a second heartbeat. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. Instead, I asked her about her colleagues and any unusual behavior she might have observed since our last conversation. "Well," she said cautiously, "there's the assistant manager, Mrs. de Vries. She sometimes rearranges files without telling anyone. Could that matter?" She looked at me nervously as though gauging my reaction. "I don't think it's anything sinister, but you never know." I filed that away. Seemingly small actions, side files moved, pages shifted, could be misdirection, or could be the first step in a pattern. I asked her about late-night edits and anyone entering the office outside normal hours. Her response was careful, measured, and yet tinged with uncertainty. She remembered seeing someone with a briefcase and a scarf lingering near the editor's floor late one night. Too general to pin blame, but specific enough to raise suspicion. From there, I took a taxi to Caro's building. He was pacing the narrow hallways when I arrived, but the moment he saw me, his expression softened, a mask of faux calm replacing his earlier irritation. "I don't know what else I can tell you," he said immediately. "I'm telling the truth." "I'm not here to judge the truth, Mr. Caro," I said, "but to observe discrepancies. Tell me, did anyone contact you about the manuscript besides the Tallmans and the assistant?" He hesitated, fingers drumming against his leg. "A courier came once, left a note asking for a minor phrasing adjustment. I didn't recognize the handwriting. I didn't keep the note." He looked almost apologetic, as if the mere recollection of it was a failure. It seemed innocuous at the time. I didn't press further. The courier could be a crucial link or a red herring. I would check publishing logs later and verify every entry. Caro's nervous energy suggested involvement or at least proximity, but direct evidence remained elusive. Next, I made my way to the Tallman residence. Rolfe, the kitchen aide, greeted me politely, though I detected a faint tension in his shoulders. "Mr. Goodwin?" he said, voice steady. "Anything further you need regarding the cookbook?" "Yes," I said. "I want to know about access. Who else enters the pantry, the storage, or the kitchen area without Mrs. Tallman's presence? Even brief visits?" Rolfe hesitated, glancing down at the floor. "Only the cleaning staff occasionally, sir. They're usually scheduled early in the morning, but I don't see them handle the cookbook itself. And sometimes Mrs. Tallman herself moves it for review. Has anyone else ever touched it, even accidentally?" He blinked, the hesitation brief but telling. "No, well, sometimes her niece, Clarissa, looks through the recipes. She's young but careful. She doesn't alter anything. Clarissa." Another node, another potential angle I had to trace. I filed the name alongside the others, noting the pattern of access to the Tallman family, household staff, publishing contacts, and now, tangentially, relatives. Every interaction offered a chance for subtle manipulation or sabotage. I spent the afternoon shadowing Clarissa, who seemed oblivious to my attention, though her movements were precisely the sort Wolfe would note consistent routines, slight deviations at moments of tension. She visited a local stationery shop and a small cafe where she frequently reviewed her family's manuscripts. I made note of the patrons she interacted with, the timing of her visits, and the items she carried, any of which could be relevant if someone sought to intercept or tamper with the cookbook outside the home. Returning to the city streets, I gathered scattered threads from the publisher, the freelance editor, and the household staff. Patterns began to emerge in the margins of my notebook, overlaps in timing, repeated instances of near access, moments when security or routine was conveniently lax. None of it was overt, but all of it was suggestive. I had to remember Wolfe's words that the smallest deviations can become keys when observed collectively. Late in the afternoon, I stopped by a small copy shop near the publisher's office. Someone had been reproducing recipes, copies of pages I had already catalogued. A clerk mentioned a frequent customer who asked for extra prints for proofreading purposes. The description fit no one on the initial list precisely, though the familiarity with the material suggested insider knowledge. I took a note, planning to verify deliveries and timing tomorrow. By the time I returned to the brownstone, the light was fading. Wolfe sat in the study, arms crossed, as if he had been waiting patiently for my report. I laid out my observations of Henshaw's late-night vigilance, Caro's nervous courier, Rolfe's hesitation, and Clarissa's unmonitored outings. I also mentioned the recurring activity near the copy shop. Wolfe's expression was inscrutable, but his fingers tapped lightly on the desk. "You have done well, Goodwin. Observation is incomplete without chronology and pattern. You have both. Now we wait for the interactions to occur naturally while we maintain surveillance and maintain our records. Each minor move may reveal the significance." I knew exactly what he meant. The real test wouldn't be found in a single act of malfeasance, but in the interplay of all actors, the assistant, the editor, the kitchen staff, the niece, and any outside agent. We were constructing a matrix of human behavior, and every detail mattered. That evening I compiled my notes, aligning each movement, each minor deviation, each delayed response. It felt like assembling a puzzle without knowing the final image. But Wolfe thrived on that ambiguity, and under his silent direction I realized that our web of observation was steadily tightening around whoever had begun tampering with the Tallman cookbook. The brownstone was quiet as I finally closed my notebook. Wolfe remained in his chair, cigar smoke curling in lazy spirals, his eyes fixed on the city below. The city's noise seemed to fade, leaving only the hum of thought and strategy. Each suspect was moving through their day, unaware of how closely their actions were being watched, and unaware that the true observation, the one that mattered, was already in motion. The next morning brought a sense of unease to the brownstone that was almost palpable. I arrived early intending to review my notes from the previous day, only to notice that the manuscript Mrs. Tallman had entrusted to Wolfe was not in its usual place on the side desk. I double-checked the surrounding shelves and trays, but it was gone. Even the careful hands of Rolfe had not accounted for this. "Fritz," I called, keeping my voice low, "have you seen the Tallman manuscript since last night?" Fritz paused, polishing silver as he always did, and gave me a measured glance. "Not since this morning, Mr. Goodwin. I did move some of the manuscripts for cleaning, but the cookbook remained untouched. Mr. Wolfe has not requested it." Wolfe, as expected, made no immediate comment, his eyes following the slow curl of smoke from his cigar. He did, however, signal a slight nod toward the desk. I knew that meant the situation was of interest, but he intended to observe first. I went through the usual channels, searching the brownstone from the basement kitchen to the upper library, checking every conceivable hiding place. Nothing. The manuscript had vanished without a trace. Even more disturbing was the fact that there was no sign of forced entry. Whoever had taken it had done so quietly, deliberately, and with knowledge of the household's routines. Rolfe was called in for questioning, and I could see the tension in his shoulders tighten further. "I did not touch it," he said, voice steady but strained. "I know how important it is. No one else should have had access. Yet someone did," I said, carefully watching his reactions. Was there any unusual activity last night? Visitors, deliveries, or cleaning staff arriving at odd hours? He shook his head. Nothing I could see. I was alone in the kitchen after everyone left, and the pantry was undisturbed when I checked it at midnight. I made note of his hesitation and the almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of his mouth, small details Wolfe would catch without needing me to point them out. Later that morning, I retraced the steps of the day before. Clara Henshaw and Henry Carow were contacted again, under the guise of routine follow-ups. Both offered alibis that seemed airtight at first glance. Yet, the more I probed subtle questions about timing, mail, courier deliveries, more inconsistencies appeared. Clara mentioned a meeting she had forgotten to include in her log. Carow misremembered whether he had handed over a set of revisions personally or via a package. It was enough to suggest a breach, but not enough to point definitively to anyone. Whoever had removed the manuscript had done so in such a way that all movements appeared normal except to someone who was watching closely. And Wolfe, sitting behind his desk, was watching me watch. The copy shop I had visited earlier yielded another clue. A series of prints matching pages from the cookbook had been made late in the night. The clerk remembered a man wearing a coat and hat, briefcase in hand, asking for multiple reproductions. The description didn't match anyone we had interviewed, though the familiarity with the material suggested insider knowledge. I returned to the brownstone with this new information. Wolfe's gaze was unyielding as I presented the facts. A new element, he said. A courier or intermediary, someone with knowledge of the manuscript but who wishes to remain obscured. Their actions suggest planning, patience, and cunning. Someone who knows the inner workings of the Torman household, I added. And the publishing office, precisely, Wolfe said. Observe, do not interfere. The removal of the manuscript is a test, Goodwin, a minor intrusion, yet a significant one. It will provoke reactions, reveal tendencies. Watch closely who responds first, who hesitates, and who attempts to manipulate events behind the scenes. I spent the afternoon cataloguing movements, retracing deliveries, and cross-referencing access points. Each suspect, Henshaw, Carow, Rolfe, even Clarissa had their schedule logged and scrutinized. Small deviations appeared. Henshaw had been seen exiting the building a few minutes earlier than her recorded departure. Carow lingered near a mailroom he had no official reason to visit. Rolfe, though outwardly composed, seemed overly attentive to the kitchen area, checking it multiple times in a short period. By evening I realized that the intruder had been clever. Whoever it was had studied the routines and exploited a narrow window of opportunity. There were no signs of haste or panic, only precision. The removal was both daring and understated, a hallmark of someone confident in their knowledge of human behavior. I returned to Wolfe's office with a list of potential avenues. They know our methods, Wolfe. Whoever took it is not only careful, but observant. They're watching how we respond. Wolfe tapped the edge of his desk lightly. Good. That observation is exactly what we need. People who take without leaving traces are often compelled to reveal themselves through overcompensation. They will act again, Archie, and when they do, we will be ready. The evening settled over the brownstone, the city lights twinkling through the large windows, casting long shadows across the study. I could feel the tension thickening, subtle but undeniable. The manuscript's disappearance was more than a mere theft. It was a psychological maneuver. Someone wanted to unsettle us, to see the Torman family and their allies react. Dinner was served, but neither Wolfe nor I ate with our usual ease. My mind was racing, cataloguing every movement, every hesitation, every deviation I had observed throughout the day. Wolfe, serene as ever, puffed on his cigar and seemed to fold the city itself into his gaze, absorbing every variable in silence. As night fell, I knew the next move would reveal far more than the manuscript itself. Whoever had committed this subtle trespass would make another action, either from confidence or misjudgment. And when that occurred, Wolfe's trap would be ready. Observation, timing, and intellectual force would expose the culprit. The brownstone had been disturbed once more, and the subtle currents of tension flowed thicker than ever, carrying with them the scent of deception, mischief, and a carefully orchestrated challenge that promised to test every ounce of our deductive skill. The next morning, the city seemed louder somehow, its noise seeping into the edges of the brownstone, a reminder that outside the sanctuary of Wolfe's office, time and chaos marched on. I was at my desk when Fritz appeared with the day's correspondence. Among the letters was a note from Mrs. Tallman. Another anonymous message had arrived, this time more direct. The words were typed in the same precise, capitalized style as before. The manuscript must be tested again. Failure will be expensive. No signature, no envelope markings beyond the sender's standard notation. Someone was escalating, and the audacity made it clear they were watching both the Tallman family and us closely. Wolfe didn't move from his chair, though the faint curl of smoke from his cigar betrayed a flicker of interest. "Goodwin," he said, "our intruder is no longer cautious. Subtle testing has given way to brazen assertion. Prepare for further developments. We cannot act yet. We must observe, and you will need Saul Panzer on standby." I nodded, already anticipating Wolfe's method, patience, observation, and strategic pressure. Saul would be necessary when the threads of subtle deception began to unravel, but for now the game was still in its early, tense stage. I retraced my steps, beginning at the publishing office. Clara Henshaw had arrived early, unusually brisk, as if to preempt any interruption. I approached cautiously, noting her movements. She checked the logbook twice before touching the manuscript drafts, paused briefly at the photocopier, then glanced at the door as if expecting someone. Her behavior was meticulous, rehearsed, yet the underlying anxiety was unmistakable. A small bead of sweat on her temple betrayed the carefully maintained composure. I asked about recent edits, the same questions I had posed before, but phrased to encourage distraction or misstatement. Clara's responses were accurate, but her phrasing faltered slightly on dates and times. Minor discrepancies, Wolfe would say, but valuable for the larger puzzle. She had motive only if she sought to curry favor or manipulate the manuscript to impress someone outside the office, yet she seemed genuinely anxious, almost fearful. Next I checked Henry Caro's apartment. He had grown more irritable overnight. His face, flush from a combination of heat and nerves, flicked toward the clock every few minutes as we spoke. When asked about deliveries, he claimed to have no memory of any unusual packages, though I noted his hesitation. One item had not been logged properly in the delivery manifest, and Caro's memory of it was vague, too vague to be convincing. Each detail he could not recall or pretended not to add to the pressure mounting on the investigation. I also revisited Rolfe at the Tallman household. The KitchenAid's behavior had shifted subtly. He was attentive to every movement, scanning the pantry and checking locks multiple times. Something about his vigilance now seemed less about loyalty and more about covering a perceived lapse. I observed the routine carefully. He moved objects just enough to obscure the manuscript's absence and replaced them with similar items to mislead any casual observer. If he was involved, the meticulousness indicated careful planning. If uninvolved, it demonstrated fear and heightened awareness. Meanwhile, I shadowed Clarissa, the niece. She appeared to move with casual grace, but I noticed her glances at the publishing office window, the way she lingered near the copy shop, and the slight hesitation before entering the streetcar. Each micro-movement suggested someone aware of potential scrutiny, yet trying to appear unaffected. Her involvement remained uncertain, but her access to both family and manuscript made her a key player. By late afternoon, I visited the copy shop again. The clerk confirmed the same mysterious figure hat and coat, briefcase in hand, had returned, requesting additional copies. The timing coincided with the period when the manuscript had last disappeared from the brownstone. I noted the window of opportunity, only a few minutes in which the person could enter the shop, obtain reproductions, and exit without being observed. Whoever orchestrated this knew the exact movements of everyone involved, both at the Tallman estate and the publishing office. Returning to the brownstone, I reported my observations to Wolfe. "The pressure is increasing," I said. "Someone is testing all of us. Every movement, every minor deviation is being watched, and the manuscript's disappearance along with these new reproductions suggests coordinated intent." Wolfe leaned back, cigar smoke curling upward. "Good. The pressure we feel is exactly what we want the intruder to generate. They are overconfident. Human nature is predictable under stress, impatience, carelessness, missteps. Saul Panzer will be ready when the next action occurs." I noted his patience, observation, and subtle anticipation. The next move would reveal the character of the interloper. If they were careful, they might wait. If they were overconfident, and mistakes would surface. And the convergence of these errors would be the key. I spent the evening compiling all observations, timing discrepancies, repeated access windows, nervous gestures, and unusual courier visits. Wolfe watched, occasionally asking for clarification, but primarily allowing the facts to organize themselves in his mind. Each detail, the exact minute Caro lingered near the mailroom, Henshaw's repeated glances at the logbook, Rolfe's meticulous rearrangement of items, was part of a matrix that would eventually expose the intruder. Dinner was a subdued affair, the usual scents of roast and fresh bread mingling with the tension of anticipation. Wolfe ate slowly, methodically, eyes occasionally lifting to observe the city skyline as though reading it like a manuscript. I knew the pressure we felt. The manuscript missing, the mysterious letters, the unexplained visits was exactly the psychological landscape Wolfe wanted. The intruder's confidence and our restraint were intertwined, a game of chess being played on multiple boards. As night descended, I reviewed the timelines once more, cross-referencing access points, deliveries, and minor inconsistencies. Patterns were emerging of overlapping schedules, small but telling deviations, and the presence of a figure moving between publishing, household, and copy shop without leaving obvious traces. The network of observation was tightening. Wolfe's final words for the day were measured. "Goodwin, remember the intruder's actions are deliberate, but human errors are inevitable. We will watch, catalogue, and wait. Every subtle misstep, every hesitation will bring us closer to clarity. There is no need for haste, only patience and precision." I settled back in my chair, absorbing the weight of the day. The pressure had indeed increased. The manuscript missing, anonymous threats, suspicious movements, but so had our understanding. The players were revealing themselves, the patterns were solidifying, and Wolfe's methodical approach ensured that when the decisive moment arrived, we would act with certainty. The following morning, the brownstone was calm, yet the air carried the quiet tension of unspoken strategy. Wolfe sat behind his desk, cigar smouldering, eyes fixed on the window, taking in the city below as if he could read its secrets from the skyline. I entered with my notebook full of observations, each detail catalogued, each anomaly highlighted, ready to report but aware that Wolfe had a method far beyond my own. "Goodwin," he said, fingers steepled. "The pressure we noted yesterday has had its effect. Minor deviations, small gestures, hidden glances have appeared across multiple individuals. It is time we position ourselves to observe their reactions in a controlled environment." I nodded, trying to follow his calm, deliberate logic. He wasn't rushing, he never did. Controlled environment, I asked. Indeed, Wolfe replied. The intruder is adept, precise, yet predictably human. They will act again. Our position will not be passive, it will be structured. We will create circumstances where observation reveals truth without the need for confrontation. I understood immediately. Wolfe's method was psychological containment. We wouldn't chase, confront, or accuse. Instead, we would orchestrate the conditions under which the intruder's own behaviors would betray them. I made a mental note to prepare Saul Panzer when Wolfe called. He would be the active hand in the field. Our first step was the publishing office. I arrived mid-morning under the pretense of reviewing manuscript drafts. Clara Henshaw was at her desk, tense but appearing composed. I asked casual questions about deadlines and edits, noting her responses and the micro-gestures, the flick of her eyes, the slight stiffening of her posture, the repeated glance toward the office door. Small signals, Wolfe would say, but cumulatively significant. Henry Caro's apartment was next. I posed questions regarding deliveries, the precise handling of manuscript pages, and minor edits that had been made. His hesitancy increased, and I could sense the tension building. He had already been uncomfortable under my prior visits, but the subtle, repeated observation amplified his unease. That, I knew, was precisely Wolfe's strategy to allow pressure to reveal fissures in composure without direct provocation. Back at the brownstone, I reported my findings. Wolfe listened, nodding slowly, absorbing each observation. They believe themselves in control, he said finally, and yet they have already made errors. Their confidence, their attempts at concealment, these are the very instruments we will use. Every slight inconsistency will be magnified by circumstance. Watch carefully. The intruder will act again under the illusion of privacy. I prepared to revisit Rolfe at the Tallman estate, this time observing routines rather than questioning directly. The kitchen aide maintained his dutiful precision, yet I noticed small signs of anxiety, repeated checking of pantry locks, lingering near cabinets where the manuscript was kept, even subtle glances toward the front door as if expecting visitors. His fidelity to procedure was exact, but the over-precision suggested either guilt or fear of oversight, both valuable for Wolfe's purposes. Clarissa's movements were next on my observation list. The niece, graceful and apparently untroubled, still displayed subtle indicators of awareness. She frequently paused in mid-action, glanced over her shoulder, and delayed gestures, tiny telltale signs that she knew she was being watched, or at least suspected the manuscript's presence was under scrutiny. Each hesitation, each micro-adjustment, was a small note Wolfe would interpret with unerring precision. By mid-afternoon, I revisited the copy shop. The clerk confirmed that the mysterious figure had returned again, requesting duplicates. The pattern now included late-night entries coinciding with times the manuscript had been absent from the brownstone. Whoever orchestrated these movements was deliberate, calculating, and confident enough to operate across multiple locations. The pressure we applied, observation, subtle questioning, and anticipation, was designed to force such confidence to slip. Returning to the brownstone, I detailed every new observation to Wolfe. The intruder is acting with a sense of security, I said. They believe our methods are ineffective, or at least delayed. Yet every movement is traceable, every gesture under scrutiny. Wolfe's fingers drummed lightly on the desk. Exactly, Goodwin. They are human, and humans, under observation, begin to create patterns, however meticulously concealed. Positioning is not about confrontation, it is about arrangement, anticipation, and timing, and in this arrangement we will find the errors that reveal intention. I understood the unfolding strategy. Wolfe was not simply waiting, he was aligning elements, creating conditions under which each participant's natural tendencies would betray themselves. The assistant, the editor, the kitchen staff, and the niece All were pieces in a carefully measured tableau. Our role was not to force movement, but to set the stage, heighten tension, and observe the emergent patterns. Late in the day, I compiled notes on overlapping schedules, minor inconsistencies, and behaviors that suggested duplicity or fear. Wolfe, smoking steadily, allowed me to arrange them in chronological order, mapping each action against time and location. The matrix that emerged was subtle, yet telling small gaps where someone could act without being observed, minute deviations in routine, and signs of anxiety that signaled internal conflict. The stage was set. Dinner was served quietly. Wolfe consumed his meal with his usual deliberation, eyes occasionally lifting to survey the city as if reading it like a manuscript. I, notebook in hand, considered the calculated movements, the subtle pressures, and the invisible forces at play. The intruder was clever, yet Wolfe's positioning, his patient orchestration, was already constraining them. Each micro-deviation, each overcompensated gesture was a note in the larger symphony of observation. As night fell, I reviewed the day's events. Henshaw's measured anxiety, Caro's increased tension, Rolfe's meticulous vigilance, and Clarissa's micro-movements. Each element, individually insignificant, collectively formed a pattern Wolfe would exploit. The pressure applied across multiple fronts: observation, strategic questioning, and subtle orchestration was designed to unmask intent without a single confrontation. The brownstone, serene and immovable, hummed quietly with strategy. Wolfe's method, the slow tightening of the observational noose, was in motion, and somewhere in the city, the intruder, confident and untroubled, or so they thought, was moving into the very trap Wolfe had set with patience, calculation, and an unerring understanding of human behavior. By mid-morning, Wolfe decided it was time to assemble the principals. The brownstone, usually a haven of quiet order, was about to host a gathering that would test nerves, reveal truths, and set the stage for the final unraveling. I prepared the office meticulously, arranging chairs, clearing the floor, and ensuring that each detail, lighting, placement, and line of sight was conducive to observation and subtle influence. Wolfe, seated in his usual chair, cigar in hand, surveyed the room with a calm intensity that made even me feel the weight of scrutiny. The first to arrive was Mrs. Tallman, dignified yet anxious, carrying the remnants of her family's legacy, the very manuscript that had been the subject of disruption. She paused at the door, glanced at Wolfe, and gave me a nod, the tension in her shoulders betraying the composure she tried to maintain. Next came Clara Henshaw. Her steps were precise, measured, yet I could detect the slight tremor in her hand as she adjusted her notebook. Each micro-gesture and overlooked flick of her hair, a subtle hesitation before sitting, was catalogued in my mind, just as Wolfe had trained me. She was aware of scrutiny, and her awareness made her movements less natural, more revealing. Henry Caro followed, entering briskly, attempting to mask nervousness behind a facade of professional composure. He offered a polite nod to Mrs. Tallman, eyes darting briefly to the manuscript, and then to Wolfe, as if weighing the risk of each glance. His posture, rigid and upright, seemed almost rehearsed, a stark contrast to the subtle tension visible in Henshaw. Rolfe arrived last, the KitchenAid, unassuming yet precise in his movements. He avoided eye contact at first, hands clasped lightly in front, but as he noted the others seated and the palpable tension in the room, he shifted slightly, restless, his gaze flicking toward the manuscript more than once. Even the smallest deviation in his demeanor hinted at awareness or worry beyond mere duty. Wolfe regarded the assembled group silently, smoke curling around his head like a halo of control. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said finally, his voice calm but authoritative, "you are gathered here in the brownstone to address certain irregularities. The Tallman family's manuscript has been, shall we say, inconsistently treated. Pages have been altered, edits made, and yet the method and motive remain undisclosed. Our objective is simple. The truth must emerge." He paused, letting the words settle. The room, though tense, was quiet, each person calculating their own position, aware that any movement, gesture, or expression could betray knowledge they wished to conceal. "I will begin with facts," Wolfe continued. "First, the manuscript was removed from its usual location overnight, without consent, without apparent forced entry. Second, multiple copies have been made outside authorized channels. Third, observations indicate behavior inconsistent with assigned responsibilities across several individuals." He allowed the weight of the words to sink in, scanning the room carefully. Clara shifted in her seat, eyes lowering, hands tightening around her notebook. Caro's jaw tightened. A slight twitch betrayed irritation and anxiety. Rolfe's fingers drummed lightly on his knees, betraying a disciplined individual pushed to the edge of vigilance. Mrs. Tallman remained composed, though the tension in her shoulders was visible, a subtle, controlled anxiety, the kind only those who bear responsibility carry. Wolfe's eyes, unblinking and sharp, fixed on me briefly, then returned to the group. "Now," he said, "I ask you to consider your actions carefully. Think of access, opportunity, and intent. The manipulation of the manuscript, whether by removal, duplication, or alteration, is not merely clerical. It is deliberate, calculated, and as with all deliberate acts, it carries a trailer pattern visible to those trained to observe it." I watched, recording each micro-expression, each involuntary gesture, knowing Wolfe's eyes caught far more than mine. He was drawing out subtleties, allowing the pressure he had cultivated over days to bear fruit. He never needed to raise his voice or demand confessions. His calm presence, methodical scrutiny, and the carefully arranged environment forced the truth closer to the surface. "Consider also," Wolfe continued, "that actions done under the impression of privacy are often the most revealing. The manuscript was handled multiple times without public observation. Yet each action left traces, whether in timing, micro-gestures, or minor inconsistencies in statements. Observation, coupled with anticipation, is sufficient to expose intention. That is why you are all here." Clara swallowed, adjusting her posture. Caro's hands clenched briefly. Rolfe's eyes darted to the manuscript, then quickly away. Each individual responded to Wolfe's measured verbal pressure, revealing themselves in subtle ways that, combined with prior observation, pointed to the dynamics at play. "I will ask a simple question," Wolfe said, his voice cutting clearly through the tension. "Who among you has taken actions concerning the manuscript beyond what was authorized by Mrs. Tallman? Who has altered, moved, or reproduced it?" He allowed the silence to grow, the weight of expectation pressing down on the room. All eyes flickered subtly, reactions minuscule but telling. Clara's fingers twitched on her notebook. Caro's gaze dropped, then quickly rose. Rolfe's stance shifted slightly, forward, his composure faltering for a heartbeat. Wolfe observed, patient and immovable, letting the tension do the work that confrontation could never achieve. Finally, he leaned back slightly, exhaling smoke. Truth is not in haste, nor in panic. It emerges under pressure when confidence is misplaced and pretense is exposed. Continue to consider your actions carefully. Each small misstep will illuminate the larger pattern. And when that pattern is complete, clarity will follow. The room remained taut, every participant aware that movement, expression, and reaction were under scrutiny. Wolfe had positioned the suspects, orchestrated the observation, and applied the subtle pressure that would, in time, reveal the interloper without a single accusation. The game was now fully in motion, each player constrained by their own decisions and reactions. I made a mental note of the smallest movements, the flick of an eyelid, the shift of a hand, the half-turn of a body. Wolfe's method, patient and precise, had created an environment where human error was inevitable, and each slip would bring us closer to understanding the manuscript's journey, the alterations made, and the motives driving them. By the time the gathering concluded, the atmosphere was dense with expectation. Each individual departed, leaving the room quiet once more. Wolfe remained seated, cigar smoke curling, his expression unreadable but eyes sharp, calculating. Observation had been applied, pressure exerted, and subtle interactions recorded. The stage was set for the eventual revelation. The brownstone, serene and implacable, had once again demonstrated its power not through action, but through intellect, anticipation, and strategy. The following morning, the brownstone carried a quiet sense of anticipation. Wolfe had instructed that all principal figures, Mrs. Tallman, Clara Henshaw, Henry Carow, Rolfe, and Clarissa, are present once again, but this time for a more focused examination. I had prepared my notes, cross-referenced every movement, and rehearsed the chronology of events in my mind. Wolfe, as always, remained calm, cigar smoke drifting lazily, eyes fixed on the city beyond the window, but I knew the gears in his mind were turning at full velocity. Wolfe began without ceremony. Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday's assembly and the observations that have followed yield a pattern. Actions, even those taken under the illusion of privacy, cannot escape the careful scrutiny of observation. Every gesture, deviation, and hesitation has been noted. He allowed the statement to hang, giving weight to his words and watching the subtle reactions as they registered. "Consider the manuscript itself," he continued, gesturing toward the Tallman cookbook resting on the desk. "It has been altered, moved, and duplicated, yet each instance carries its own mark, visible to those trained to observe. Access points, timing, and behavior have all been traced, leaving a trail not of ink or paper, but of human intention." Clara Henshaw shifted in her chair, fingers nervously tightening around her notebook. Carow's posture stiffened, and even Rolfe, ordinarily composed, exhibited a subtle tension. Clarissa, quiet and composed, appeared calm, but her eyes betrayed a fleeting flicker of an unconscious acknowledgement of her role in the unfolding truth. Wolfe's gaze swept over each of them with surgical precision. "The initial removal of the manuscript," Wolfe said, "occurred during a window when both Henshaw and Carow had verified tasks, yet discrepancies in their stated timelines, however minor, suggest an opportunity for intervention. Observations confirmed overlapping access points and the presence of an unidentified intermediary courier noted at the copy shop, familiar with the material, operating without detection." He paused, allowing the information to settle. Yet it was not this intermediary who acted alone. I watched Wolfe carefully, noting the way he orchestrated the focus. He did not accuse, did not rush. His words created pressure, and under it, the truth began to surface through behavior alone. "Rolfe, the KitchenAid," Wolfe continued, "exhibited heightened vigilance when previously ordinary routines were altered. Yet his micro-gestures, hesitation, repeated glances, over-precise adjustments revealed an awareness inconsistent with mere duty. He feared observation, but fear alone does not compel replication or manipulation." He turned slightly toward Clarissa. "And you, Clarissa, your access to the manuscript combined with observation of previous movements indicates a level of familiarity and confidence in handling the material. Yet your actions, timing, micro-adjustments, and subtle behavioral deviations demonstrate both knowledge and anxiety." Clara Henshaw, sensing the narrowing circle, opened her mouth, then closed it. Carow's lips pressed thinly, his eyes narrowing in sudden comprehension. Wolfe continued without pause, The manuscript was removed not by chance, nor by an opportunistic intermediary. It was deliberately manipulated by one individual who had access, understanding, and motive. The motive was not personal gain in the usual sense, nor mere mischief. It was testing. Testing the reactions of those responsible for maintaining the integrity of the Tallman legacy. Wolfe's gaze fixed on Clarissa with unerring precision. And in this, your actions betrayed both intent and opportunity. The timing of your visits, the micro-movements, and your familiarity with both family and publishing routines identify you as the primary agent responsible for the alterations, removals, and duplications. Clarissa's composure faltered, a brief flush colouring her cheeks. "Only wanted to help," she stammered, "to ensure the manuscript was perfect." "I never intended." Wolfe held up a hand. "Intent does not absolve method, and method, in this case, was deliberate, precise, and revealing. You sought to perfect the manuscript, yet each alteration carried the mark of your intervention. Your careful orchestration, though subtle, left trace patterns observable under sustained scrutiny. I could see the relief mixed with dread on Mrs. Tallman's face. She exhaled slowly, leaning slightly forward, realizing the culpability lay not with the household staff or publishing personnel, but within her family's immediate circle. Rolfe exhaled in quiet resignation, perhaps relieved not to bear the full weight. Henshaw and Caro seemed to relax, though tension still lingered as the precision of Wolfe's deduction settled over them. The courier at the copy shop, Wolfe added, was an extension of Clarissa's intent, utilized to replicate pages for review under the guise of legitimate activity. Minor, yet instrumental in concealing the origin and scope of alterations. Clarissa lowered her gaze, nodding slowly. "Yes," she admitted, "I only wanted to help. The recipe changes were meant to correct mistakes I thought existed. I didn't know how else to ensure the manuscript was flawless." Wolfe's expression remained unreadable. "Flawless in your eyes, perhaps, but at the expense of the trust and responsibility entrusted to you. Knowledge and access confer power, but with it comes duty. The error was not in your effort, but in assuming authority without consent." I made a note, observing the final convergence of actions. Wolfe's method had drawn the confession out not through force or coercion, but through meticulous pressure, observation, and timing. Each movement, each hesitation had revealed the culprit without a single raised voice. Finally, Wolfe leaned back, the calm in his presence filling the room. "The manuscript will be restored, corrections reversed, and order returned. Let this serve as a lesson in responsibility, observation, and respect for process. No one acting within a position of trust may exercise discretion without acknowledgement of its limits." Clarissa nodded, the tension leaving her shoulders in slow waves, acceptance settling into her posture. Mrs. Tallman approached her, placing a gentle hand on her arm, a quiet reconciliation of understanding and relief. The other parties, Henshaw, Caro, Rolfe, remained in respectful silence, acknowledging Wolfe's resolution without question. As I left my notes on the desk, Wolfe took a final drag from his cigar. "Goodwin," he said quietly, "all has been observed, corrected, and concluded. The instruments of human error and intention have been catalogued and addressed. Let us now return to quietude." The brownstone exhaled with us, its calm returning, the tension dissipating like smoke curling toward the ceiling. The manuscript would survive intact, the Tallman legacy preserved, and the subtle mechanisms of observation and intellect had once again prevailed. The brownstone returned to its accustomed calm, the tension that had been palpable for days dissipating like morning fog. Wolfe remained in his chair, cigar smoke drifting lazily, observing the city through the tall windows with that same unblinking, precise gaze that suggested the resolution of one case was merely a prelude to the next. I, on the other hand, moved through the office with a mixture of relief and reflection, cataloguing the final observations and ensuring that all notes were in order for Mrs. Tallman. The Tallman family's manuscript, restored and intact, lay on the desk where it belonged. Its pages, unaltered and authoritative, reflected the work of generations, and I realized the care of a detective who required not only logic, but also an understanding of human nature to resolve such a delicate matter. Clarissa sat nearby, quiet, her earlier confession having cleared the air, though her posture remained slightly guarded, a reminder that personal lessons often linger beyond immediate resolution. "Archie," Wolfe said without turning, voice calm but deliberate. "You observed carefully, followed the threads and maintained discretion. You ensured that human tendencies, error, hesitation, misjudgment, were allowed to reveal truth without interference. That is precisely the method required." I chuckled lightly, trying to mask the tension that had gripped me over the last several days. "I didn't interfere," I admitted. "Mostly." "Wolfe, I have to say, watching people squirm under your observation is more exhausting than chasing them across the city." He allowed a faint hum, his version of a smile, I supposed. "Observation is an exercise of patience, Goodwin, not endurance. Yet I concede that your efforts on the streets are equally vital. You execute the necessary legwork while I maintain perspective." I set aside my notebook and glanced at the restored manuscript. It's funny, isn't it? A family's legacy threatened not by greed or malice, but by misplaced ambition and an overzealous attempt at perfection. Wolfe finally turned his eyes to me, sharp and calculating. Funny indeed, but instructive. Knowledge and access are potent. So is the misuse of both. Clarissa's intent was not malicious, but the execution carried risk, exposure, and disruption. There is wisdom in understanding boundaries, intellectual, personal, and procedural. The quiet of the office was punctuated by the gentle clatter of Fritz, arranging the remnants of tea and dessert from the day before. He cast a glance at Wolfe, then at me, a subtle acknowledgement that the household had returned to its natural order. Even the city's distant noise seemed less intrusive, contained by the walls of the brownstone and the calm authority that had resolved the matter. Mrs. Tallman, ever composed but visibly relieved, approached Wolfe. "Thank you, Mr. Wolfe," she said softly, "for your discretion, your patience, and your guidance. I see now how delicate the situation was and how easily it could have unraveled." Wolfe inclined his head slightly, accepting her gratitude with minimal expression. "Preservation of order, Mrs. Tallman, is not a courtesy but a necessity. Disruption, however minor, tests human nature. Observation, patience, and strategy ensure stability." I made a mental note to add that line to my own catalogue of Wolfe's aphorisms. It had been another demonstration of his method: calm intellect applied where others might see chaos, subtlety wielded where others would raise voices or threaten consequences. The method had worked, the manuscript intact, and the lessons of human behaviour once again revealed. Clarissa remained near the desk, fidgeting slightly with her hands. Wolfe's next words were directed at her, precise and weighted. "Let this be instructive, Clarissa. Intervention without authority, even with the best intent, carries consequences. The integrity of the family's work depends not on enthusiasm alone, but on responsibility, acknowledgement, and the correct exercise of discretion." Her eyes lowered, and a quiet nod followed. I noted her posture, relaxed now, but with the memory of tension still lingering, a subtle reminder that the human element, once stressed, remains sensitive to observation long after the immediate threat has passed. I wandered over to the windows, glancing down at the city streets below, their chaos and rhythm continuing unabated. In the midst of this vast, noisy metropolis, we had conducted an operation of quiet intelligence. No alarms were raised, no public scenes made. The instruments of intellect and observation had prevailed, leaving only the reflection of human tendencies and the delicate resolution of a minor but meaningful crisis. Fritz entered with dinner, a simple yet impeccably prepared meal. Wolfe acknowledged it with a nod, and I followed suit, though my appetite was tempered by the mental exertion of the past several days. As we ate, the conversation remained minimal. Wolfe's reflections, as always, were sparse but incisive. "Human behavior," he said finally, after a thoughtful pause, "is both predictable and elusive. Misjudgment, concealment, and overconfidence are instruments of revelation when applied under the proper conditions. We have observed, waited, and allowed the natural course to uncover truth. That is the method." I leaned back, letting the weight of his words settle. It was a fitting conclusion, not only to the immediate problem, but to the entire process. The removal of the manuscript, the anonymous letters, the subtle intrusions, and the orchestrated observations that had revealed both motive and method without recourse to coercion or confrontation. As the evening deepened, the brownstone exhaled along with us. The manuscript rested securely on the desk. The Tallman family's legacy, once threatened by well-intentioned interference, was intact. The individuals involved had confronted their roles, recognized their responsibilities, and understood the boundaries that guided both action and consequence. Wolfe, ever the stoic observer, finally allowed himself a small sip of his wine, eyes closing briefly in satisfaction. I set my notebook aside, feeling the calm that follows completion, not of physical exertion, but of the successful orchestration of human behavior, subtle observation, and intellectual dominance. The city outside continued its relentless pace, oblivious to the quiet triumph that had unfolded within the brownstone. And as I glanced at Wolfe, cigar smoke curling upward in gentle spirals, I knew that the lesson, like the manuscript, preserved intellect, observation, and precise timing are the most effective tools in the pursuit of justice and understanding, far more potent than any action taken in haste. The city lights flickered beyond the tall windows, the hum of distant traffic a soft undertone to the quiet that had finally settled over the brownstone. Wolfe sat in his chair, cigar smouldering, the manuscript restored and pristine on his desk. I leaned back in mine, notebook closed, feeling the weight of the day's work finally ease from my shoulders. The case was resolved, yet the satisfaction came not from action, but from watching human nature reveal itself under pressure, as Wolfe had always insisted. Archie Wolfe began, voice calm but commanding. The resolution of this case demonstrates a principle often overlooked. Access and intent, when combined with observation and subtle pressure, expose truth more effectively than confrontation or force. The manuscript was imperiled not by malevolence, but by human misjudgment and overconfidence. Each action left traces, and every trace was noted. I allowed a faint smile. "You mean all those little gestures, glances, hesitations were clues, even when everyone thought they were being careful?" Wolfe inclined his head slightly. "Precisely. Human behavior, though easily controlled in appearance, cannot suppress the impulses and inconsistencies that emerge under stress and scrutiny. One need only know what to observe." Mrs. Tallman had returned briefly, her demeanor calm but tinged with relief. "Thank you, Mr. Wolfe," she said softly, "for your discretion, your patience, and your insight. I see now that even small actions can have wide consequences." "You are welcome," Wolfe replied, in that clipped, deliberate tone. "Let this serve as a reminder: authority and access carry responsibility. oversight, and observation are the only guarantees that integrity will endure. Clarissa, seated nearby, appeared more composed now, yet a faint tension lingered in her posture. Wolfe's words seemed to reach her directly. "I understand," she said quietly. "I misjudged my role. I will not repeat the error." Rolfe, the kitchen-aide, and the others had departed earlier, leaving the brownstone in its natural, measured quiet. Wolfe finally allowed his gaze to soften slightly, smoke curling around him like a halo of contemplative thought. I poured us each a drink, and we sat in silence for a few moments, the kind of silence that only comes when a case has concluded with precision and intellect rather than spectacle. I could feel the rhythm of the brownstone resuming its own pulse, familiar and comforting. Archie, Wolfe said, breaking the silence, noted that intellect, observation, and patience are instruments of justice far superior to haste or force. The preservation of order requires not strength, but comprehension and the ability to manipulate circumstances without interference. I chuckled softly, shaking my head. And here I was hoping for a quiet evening after a missing manuscript, anonymous letters, and a courier running around town. "You make it sound like poetry." "It is poetry," Wolfe replied, eyes returning to the manuscript. "In the pattern of human error and intention there is clarity, and in clarity there is justice. The rest is mere circumstance." I leaned back, letting the weight of the lesson sink in. Watching the intricate dance of human motives, the careful positioning, the subtle pressures, this was the true elegance of Wolfe's work. No one had been harmed, no law broken beyond minor transgressions, yet the resolution had been complete, intellectual, and morally precise. Dinner was served, and for the first time in days, the meal felt unhurried. The aromas of roast, bread, and fresh vegetables mingled with the lingering scent of cigar smoke, and I realized that in this quiet after the storm, the brownstone had reclaimed its sanctuary. Wolfe's satisfaction, subtle though it was, radiated in the calm of the room, a testament to the efficacy of observation and intellect over chaos and impulsive action. I glanced at the manuscript once more, its pages now secure and pristine. The Toulmin legacy was intact, the subtle trespass corrected, and the lessons of human nature revealed without the need for drama. Clarissa's confession, voluntary and reflective, closed the circle. Wolfe had orchestrated the exposure, not through confrontation, but through understanding, timing, and pressure applied with precision. As I settled into my chair, Wolfe lifted his gaze to mine, the faintest acknowledgement of approval passing between us. "Cases such as these," he said, finally lowering the cigar, "illustrate that human error, when guided by opportunity and unchecked by observation, can disrupt even the most orderly of systems. It is our duty to observe, to anticipate, and to act with reason rather than impulse." I poured the last of my drink and offered a wry grin. "Well, I'd call that a job well done, Wolfe. No chase scenes, no fistfights, just brains, observation, and patience. Your kind of victory." Wolfe's only response was a slow, deliberate exhalation of smoke and the faintest nod, signaling that the lesson had been received, the case concluded, and the brownstone had returned to its rightful state, calm, controlled, and intellectually triumphant. The city outside hummed on, unaware of the subtle battle that had unfolded within these walls, and I realized that, in this quiet, measured way, justice had been served not through action, but through the enduring power of intellect, observation, and moral clarity.